I'm Gary Nickerson,
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
and this is Outside My Window. Our guest in this segment is Michael Marquardt. A native of Berlin, Germany, Michael moved to the United States soon after the Berlin Wall crumbled in 1989. He led a fast-growing technology company before being recruited to drive a new startup venture in late 1999, serving for 7 years as co-founder and chief executive of the health services company MediGuide. He has taken on several other key corporate leadership roles, and with 25 years of experience in international business, he is a frequent keynote speaker who specializes in inspiring audiences of senior business leaders on how to be successful, engaging in cross-cultural business relationships, and most recently, cybersecurity. Welcome to our podcast, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Michael, what was it like growing up as a teenager when the Berlin Wall came down?
Oh my God, I tell you, so I was born in 1970, really what was then described as the height of the Cold War between the East and the West. And Berlin at the time was divided into 4 sectors. There was the American sector, there was the British sector, the French sector, and the Soviet sector. And the Soviet sector, we refer to as East Berlin. And then the other 3 sectors were, of course, West Berlin. And probably like any kid growing up, I thought that that's sort of the way everybody lived. That you had a city that kind of had military in it, and that you had checkpoints that when you were going in and out of the city. And I remember very distinctly, my father took me to Paris, which was about an hour by plane, hour 10 minutes from Berlin, when I was 11 years old, and I was glued to the window looking out of the plane as we were landing. My dad didn't say anything. It was just always looking out the window. And but I was clearly looking for something. And then we went up to the Eiffel Tower in Paris later that day. And again, I was looking. It's like, Michael, are you looking for something? And it's like, yeah, I'm looking for their wall. And I thought that every capital city at least would have a wall around it. And I wanted to be able to see it just like I could see the wall around Berlin. And of course, that's really when I first consciously realized that Berlin was different. And that for very unique historical circumstances, our city of West Berlin had become an island in the former communist, country of East Germany. So, but again, like you adapt to your circumstances. And as I was growing up, I thought it was perfectly normal to see tanks in the street and to see soldiers, American soldiers, British soldiers, French soldiers, and walking around. And when we turned on the radio, this is again 70s and 80s. There was no cable television. When we turned on the radio, we would hear American music, French music, British music, much more so than German music. And so I was very early on kind of became fascinated with America and American culture, loved American music, American movies. And my parents had some friends that lived in the United States, including some colleagues of my father. My father was a surgeon and a physician. And so I had gone to the United States as a teenager, when I was 13, then again when I was 16, and I just became fascinated with America and decided to make a move when I was 20, and never looked back.
Why never look back? Like, was there some sort of a trigger to that attitude as you came into the U.S.?
No, that's a great question. I would say that when people have asked me that before, it wasn't so much that I was not wanting to look back or that I had it wasn't driven by what I was leaving, but more where I was going. And I was kind of sort of thinking I had my whole life ahead of me and I was sort of focused on the future. And I figured I could always come back to Germany. I could always come back to Berlin. And it's important to realize at the time, Berlin and Germany were going to be undergoing reunification. This was going to be a very complex and expensive undertaking. And at the same time, we were in the middle of sort of the computer revolution, if you want to put it that. This is now, we're talking in, 89, 90, 91. The internet started to play a role in business starting in the early 90s. And I just sort of felt that everything kind of future oriented was more located in North America than in Europe. And so I just really decided that it would really be exciting to essentially start my own life in America after graduating high school in Berlin, and so I decided to go to school. I picked a very small university in Maine, actually, obviously direct neighbor to Canada, with a large French Canadian and French American population. And I went to the University of New England, the only university I applied to, by the way. But yeah, I was really not so much that I didn't want to look back. I just figured that I could always go back to Germany if I desired to. But I really sort of felt like maybe any other immigrant that I wanted to kind of start a new life in America.
How long was it before you first went back and visited with Germany?
Literally only about 2 months later, because it was a significant birthday of one of my grandmothers, and also because I didn't yet have an immigrant type visa. I had first traveled over on a tourist visa because I had not yet been accepted at the university. So literally 2 months later, and I literally, as you may be familiar, or maybe not everybody is familiar, but when you at least in those days, when you booked a flight to the U.S., you had to have a return flight. I mean, you couldn't just buy a one-way ticket, and you had to prove.
Yeah, they kind of frown on that, don't they? They frown on the one-way tickets.
Right, and so I had booked this. I said, well, what do I pick as a return date? And I looked at the calendar, and I saw that my grandmother's round birthday, I forget what it was, but a big round birthday was coming up literally 2 months later. So I said, well, my tourist visa I think is for up to 3 months, so I'll book this round trip basically. I'm over there for 2 months. Hopefully by then I will have been accepted at university, and then I will bring that paperwork back and apply for my student visa. And that's precisely what happened. And then once I had my student visa in hand, I was able to immediately turn around and have a one-way ticket back to the U.S.
Now, 2 months doesn't sound like a lot of time, but how much had Germany changed?
Well, Germany, I would say, I can specifically speak to Berlin. The Berlin Wall had fallen in November of '89. Germany was reuniting in October of 1990. I had left in May of '91, and so then came back, in the summer for just a couple of weeks, and you could tell that the mood in the city and the mood in the country were definitely changing about as quickly as I had seen it before. I mean, you could start seeing construction. I did notice that within a very short period of time, there was a tremendous amount of construction. I think at one point later in 1990 and early 91, people were saying that there's more construction going on in Berlin than in any other place in the world, including Shanghai. And that's just because they literally had to rebuild the entire East. But I also could sense a change in mood that really related to the tremendous undertaking as well, and the significant resources that were going to be needed by the state to be able to build out infrastructure. I mean, literally, wiring the country for the late 20th century with telephone and everything else, and building gas stations and all the kinds of things that you typically have. I mean, a lot of buildings in East Berlin, it's hard to believe, but a lot of buildings in East Berlin and East Germany in 1990 still had scars and holes from World War II. They had not been fixed fully. And so what I mean by the mood changing in the country a little bit even just within 2 months, is that there were clearly tax rises on the horizon. The government had to find a way to pay for all of this, and so you could sense, the fact that the initial elation over reunification and people being just tremendously relieved that the country and the city would no longer be divided, kind of gave way to a realization of the really decade that lay ahead to reconnect subway lines and reconnect water systems and reconnect electrical infrastructure and rebuild universities and so forth. It was just a tremendous undertaking, and so I could definitely sense that even just after 2 months.
So when you came back for that short visit, did you feel like, oh, maybe I'll stay?
No, and it's interesting. I've shared this before. When I first left, in preparation for first leaving, I had sold my car, which was a used VW Golf that was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and my parents understood that. But then I sold my microwave oven and my stereo system, and my mother didn't quite understand that because she said, I could store that for you, until you come back. And I said, well, I really don't intend to come back. And no offense, but I really don't think I will be back. And I obviously can't take these with me because we have a different electrical system in the U.S. and the plugs don't work. And I would love to take my stereo and on my microwave, but I can't. And but no, it really was one of these things where I had decided that this is what I was going to do, and at that time, I have to say, there were some other things that probably just really formed the attraction to the United States, that really kind of didn't leave a lot of room for me to feel that, I like the sausages and some of the German foods and so forth, but I really would like to live in the United States and go to school there.
So how did your parents feel about that? I mean, you were pretty adamant that this is your path. So how did they feel about that?
Well, my parents had two different reactions. My dad could completely relate, and he said that if he were my age, he would completely have perhaps done the same thing. He grew up during World War II. It's a different time, but he said he was fully supportive. My mother was not supportive. She couldn't believe that I would want to move that far away and sort of forsake all the all the support and all the connections and ways that obviously your family can help you out when you first get started in your career, or all the ways that obviously typically parents help out their young children when they first sort of make it in the world. And I didn't have any siblings. I don't have any siblings, and so I'm sure it was, in retrospect, it was harder for my parents than I actually realized at the time. And I mean, both were supportive of me overall, and they came to visit me about 6 months into this, and saw that I was happy and so forth. But my dad was very understanding and supportive. My mother sort of was certain that I would be back within months, sort of hat in hand, and probably disappointed when I would report that I'm really loving it in the U.S. So that's really what happened.
So why the University of New England? What attracted you to that? I mean, how many universities are there in the U.S., right? But you settled in on that one.
Yeah, I'll tell you. I can tell you exactly what happened. So first of all, unlike today, when maybe one of the first things that somebody in Germany might do is to consult Google and look at universities, or or go on Facebook and sort of say, oh, well, where's everybody else going? There was no internet back then, and so my literally sole database that I could consult of even the names of universities was what was the U.S. News and World Report, which had copies at what was called the America House, which is basically the sort of a cultural institution that was attached to the American consulate in Berlin. And you could go in there and you could, even as a German citizen, you could go in there and you could find copies of Time magazine that were only a couple of weeks old, or you could read the New York Times, on paper. And I found a copy of U.S. News and World Report, and I saw that. Frankly, I'll tell you exactly what happened. I looked through the list, and I saw some names I recognized, like Harvard and Yale and Stanford, and some things I've seen on TV, and then there was a area to the right where it listed dates, and they were sort of admission deadlines, is what the headline was, and I noticed that all the dates had already passed for going to school. My plan had been to go to school that fall, and I was looking in March, and they had deadlines of August, September, October of the previous year, and then the University of New England listed in the same column. It listed rolling admissions. So I went up to the librarian and I asked her, what does rolling mean? And she didn't have a good answer, but she sort of said, well, it seems that they sort of take it on a case-by-case basis. And I just figured, well, that was better than, my applying to university that already published in U.S. News and World Report that, you can now apply for essentially 2 years from now, or a year and a half from now. And so that was one criterion. There really weren't that many universities that had rolling admissions. The second was that I was interested in studying medicine after, even though I didn't quite understand the whole difference between college and university, and that before you go to medical school, that you had to go to college. So I looked for universities that had a medical school with it, and the University of New England has a medical school attached to it, which not that many smaller universities did, and not of the ones that had rolling admissions. And then the third thing was that I, having been to the U.S. twice before as a teenager, I had been to New York City, and I had been to Boston, and I, having grown up in a big city like Berlin, I realized that both New York and Boston would have would hold a lot of distractions for me, and I wanted to be not in the middle of nowhere. Like I didn't want to be in Nebraska or in North Dakota or someplace like that. But I figured at that point I wanted to be in a place that if I really wanted to, I could get in my car and I could go to New York within 4 or 5 hours, or go to Boston, let's say in 2 hours. It wasn't like 12 hours drive. And at the same time, it was far enough away that I really could just focus on my studies, and which is what I did. And so the University of New England ended up being the only university that I applied to. And I literally showed up off the plane and went into the admissions office and asked for the admissions documents and the application forms, filled them out right there in the office, and handed them in the same day. And then 2 weeks later, I had a provisional acceptance, and they sent me to do some tests of English as a foreign language, the TOEFL test, and then I received the final acceptance.
When did you feel that your entrepreneurial spirit really came to life? Was it during university, or was it after university that you decided to take this course on the consulting side of business?
Yes, it was really after university that I came to realize that I had a real knack for business, and I'll tell you exactly what happened. So my plan had been to go to medical school, as I mentioned, and the United States actually, without my knowledge, had changed immigration laws in the early 90s as part of a World Trade Organization deal. And what that meant is that as a non-U.S. citizen, when you go to medical school, you were prohibited from receiving any kind of scholarship or fellowship or anything along those lines. And then more importantly, after you receive your MD or DO degree, and this is still the case today, they made an arrangement where you had to leave the United States for 2 years to go back to your home country prior to you being able to take an internship or anything like that at a U.S. hospital or anything like that. And so once I became aware of that, which was about in 1993, sort of 2 years into my studies, I decided to change to instead of going to medical school next, I would go to graduate school in biochemistry and chemistry. And my thinking was that I might get a PhD or a master's degree and then sort of see where that takes me. And as I was doing that, the internet really took off. This was when the Netscape browser sort of exploded in usage in 94, 95. And even the chemistry research I was doing, which I don't think I mentioned, I went to the University of Virginia on a full scholarship. And in that research, we were starting to use the internet for everything. And this was before almost anybody had email, but we're using the internet for our research. And then it became very clear that I was very attracted to what the potential of this technology could mean for business. And so I decided that rather than continuing down the path of chemistry or medicine or biochemistry, that I would sort of see where this technology would go, and so I started. I accepted an appointment at one of the first real sort of pure internet companies, and left with a master's degree from UVA. And the chairman of our chemistry department said, "Look, Michael, you can always come back." But at that point, that's really when joining a small company that I think I was the 13th or 14th employee, and after 6 months we were 150 people. That's, I think, when I really got the entrepreneurial bug of sort of realizing the impact that I could have in a company that would grow, and then perhaps start my own company, and that's really what happened.
When you're doing your consulting part of the business, it's more one-on-one. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved with some wonderful clients over the years, and so after really helping build 3 different companies over almost 20 years, I decided that what I really enjoyed is work with different companies and helping them grow. And so from a consulting and sort of advisory perspective, I started focusing on helping companies that want to expand, for example, overseas, that might be looking for new business opportunities in Asia or in Europe. And I would get very involved in the hands-on way. And I really enjoy making connections with people. I enjoy making introductions for people. I enjoy trying to solve a business problem collaboratively with others, and also kind of being in a bit of a teaching role. I would say that there's an old saying that you can either choose to sell fish or you can choose to teach people how to fish. I've always subscribed more to the latter. I like teaching people how to fish, and so it's a little bit like I like doing work where, for example, there's an American company, and I've worked with quite a few now over the years, that have a very successful business, maybe in North America, maybe in Canada, maybe in the US, maybe even in Mexico. And they have been dreaming about expanding that business to to maybe to the UK, maybe to Germany, maybe to France, maybe to as far away as Singapore or Australia or India. Oftentimes somebody just needs a starting point. They might need an initial connection. They might need somebody to sit in the room with them and sort of, or sit on a Zoom with them and sort of say, well, how would we go about that? What would be one of the first things that we would do? Could you help us with that? And I get a great degree of intellectual stimulation out of out of making those introductions and helping somebody get started. And it's, when you have a lot of local knowledge, I'm sure if somebody were to speak with you about getting involved in an area of business that you know a lot about, maybe news broadcasting, and they're thinking of coming to Nova Scotia, you would probably know who to introduce them to or who not to introduce them to, and sort of give them the lay of the land. And I'm having worked in a number of countries over the last several decades. I'm very happy to make those introductions, not just in the United States, but in Germany and Switzerland and Austria, in India and Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia, in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Not everywhere, but about 10, 11 countries where I'm very well connected and very well networked. And really until the pandemic, was traveling to on a really, really regular basis. I would be in Asia every few months. I would be in Europe almost every month. And now it's of course all been virtual travel and keeping up those connections. But yeah, I've always enjoyed being hands-on. Probably also in part because when I was running companies myself, I have to say I wasn't very enamored with most consultants that would sort of sit behind a desk and sort of kind of second guess decisions. I'd like to get involved in the middle of it and let's just actually solve this. And I remember one case in a client of a company that Quinn, you're very familiar with. I enjoyed getting directly involved with clients in Asia and try to understand, what were their needs specifically, and would this be something that that this company could address or not, rather than just sort of pontificating. I like getting into the trenches myself.
Do you find in dealing with countries overseas that it's more of a cultural thing when you're trying to make those kinds of introductions? Do people still view possibly a U.S. based company as a intrusion or a bad thing?
I would say it varies. It's a great question. I would definitely say that there needs to be much more of a recognition of the cultural differences around the world, especially for Americans. And I would say this to all my American friends. There's often a presumption that everything in another country works sort of the same way that it works in America, and that's almost never true. And it's not so much that Americans are perceived in another country as not welcome or something. It's just more that take an example. If somebody were to contact you from another country and about maybe having some meetings in your neck of the woods, in Canada, in Nova Scotia, and you're like, oh, this could be an interesting business relationship. This could be really good. This could be a win-win. And you're having some phone conversations, maybe some email exchanges, maybe you do a Zoom. And then the next thing that somebody does is they send you an email and they say, oh, we've been looking at our calendar and we're thinking, we've looked at flights and we've looked at hotels, and we're thinking that it would really suit our schedule if we could arrive at your location on December 24th. That's a Tuesday. We're thinking maybe that night we could have dinner and then just maybe spend some time at your offices on December 25th and the 26th. and then maybe you just have some recommendations for us for that weekend, and then we fly back. Your first reaction would probably be, my God, they haven't even done the research to realize that that's Christmas.
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously not a good time for us. And, but we don't want to be rude. What do we do? Guess what? I have met very few American executives or entrepreneurs, for that matter, whether they're from California or from New York or from Detroit, who have not made a similar type of mistake around a very important Chinese holiday or a very important German holiday or a very important Indian holiday, planning their travels, being completely oblivious to the fact that, there may be an important day that week that everybody in that country observes. And it gives, as an American, it gives you a bad name. It sort of makes you like completely clueless about the rest of the world. And so I find more cultural issues like that, where the opposite is also true. When you really do pay attention to those things and you really are connected in that country, you get extra double credit for mentioning to a foreign counterpart, maybe in Malaysia or such and such, that now I recognize that Friday will be the birthday of the Sultan, of such and such. Is that still a good day for you? And it's like, oh, you know that? Nobody knows that outside of Malaysia. And in this day of the internet, it's not that hard to find these things out. And so I think between that and sort of understanding negotiating styles and cultural differences in the way that companies work, and that business is done, I do think a lot of the times there is a perfect match between a buyer's need and a seller's ability to supply the services or the product. But what gets in the way is a complete cultural misunderstanding all around that never leads to a comfort level to actually do business. And I like bridging that gap. I mean, I like being sort of the interpreter in between sometimes when it's needed, so that things don't get stuck where they don't need to. There could very well be business differences that can't be bridged, but when it's simply just the fact that somebody misunderstood somebody else, and not just language, but culturally misunderstood them, or offended them, even worse, because they didn't know what they weren't supposed to do. And again, I'll give you just one small example. I remember being involved in a meeting. This is not in Germany. This is in Hong Kong. I remember being involved in this meeting in Hong Kong that had taken 3 months to set up. And I arrived there a day early. It was a very high-level meeting. It was a very important meeting. And I was responsible for my side, but then we had another group coming in from the United States, from California, was a business partner. And I had not been able to be involved in sort of any preparation, but this was a very big company, very worldly, very internationally savvy. And then there were our counterparts from Hong Kong. And we literally, I'll never forget this, I'm in the conference room. We're all walking into the conference room, I should say. And the business partner of mine, who had just flown in from California, comes into the conference room, plops himself down at one of the chairs, pulls out his business cards, and starts shooting them across the table, sort of like as if you're like dealing cards, handing out his business cards. One of them went on the floor, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this meeting is over before it even began. It's not how you hand out business cards. He then took some business cards, put them right in his back pocket, which you also don't do. He never took the cards with both hands. He didn't hand them out with both hands. And I'm thinking, oh man, we prepared all this time. We flew all this way, and we might as well. This meeting is over, and it was over because we'd been completely culturally offensive. It would be the same as coming into somebody's office and sitting in your seat and putting your feet on the table and saying, let's talk. You'd be like, okay, get out of my office.
Yeah.
And so again, I enjoy bridging those types of gaps when they need to be bridged. And so in that sense, I do get very hands-on.
So let's take a step away from the business side for a second and chat a bit about your wife. Your wife Claire is a bit of a trailblazer on her own, but give us some background. How did you meet? I mean, doing all this schooling and business work and whatever. Where did you meet your wife?
Yes, I met my wife. Actually, I should say that I was widowed when I was 30. I lost my first wife to cancer. And so after just 5 years of marriage, I was widowed. And then I met my wife Claire 2 years after that at a business reception in Delaware. And at the time, my wife was serving as senior counsel to Joe Biden, who was then in the Senate. So he was the senior senator from Delaware at the time. This was back in 2001. And so again, I was widowed. She was his senior counsel. We actually attended a reception for that was a reception for to commemorate the fact that China was entering the World Trade Organization. And at the time, then Senator Biden was very involved as the in that process because he was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Senate at the time. And again, my wife was sort of his lead staff person, and so we sat next to each other at this lunch reception that had a lot of Chinese attendees and had a lot of American attendees, and that's how we met. And she had actually, you will enjoy this. She had started as a journalist and reporter for a CBS affiliate in Delaware and Maryland, and then had gone to law school at night, and then had taken a job first with Delaware's governor, and then with then Senator Joe Biden. So that's how we met.
Wow. No, give us a sense of what she's doing for work now and why that's so important.
Yeah, so it's sort of amazing, I have to say. For the last 2 years, my wife Claire has been serving as the commissioner of the Department of Correction of the state of Delaware. And that means, to translate it into plain language, that she oversees the state's prison system. So all state prisons, which effectively in Delaware means all prisons, there are no city jails or no county prisons, fall under her responsibility. And so she's the first woman to run the state prisons. It's obviously a law enforcement role. She has she wears a uniform at times, not every day. But she has it's the largest law enforcement agency in the state, and there's the state police and there's the Department of Correction, and so she has oversees, I think it's a total of about 15 facilities throughout the state of Delaware, with I think somewhere around 4,000 inmates, and obviously a large core of correctional officers, and then they have probation and parole officers. And it's sad to say that in as I think everybody knows, there are more inmates per capita in the United States than there are in much of the world for various reasons. But a lot of her work has been focused on actually helping with reentry of individuals that come out of prison to reintegrate them into society. That was one of the reasons that she accepted the role, is to help with that. Then, of course, she did not foresee when she took this responsibility, and she's part of the governor's cabinet, is what it's called in the U.S. She did not foresee that we'd be living through a once in a 100-year pandemic, and so obviously running a state prison system is not a it's not for the faint of heart, I shall say. under normal circumstances. Doing it in the middle of a pandemic has really been a tremendous challenge, and I'm very proud of her because overall, the Delaware state prison system has weathered the pandemic, at least in my estimation, really better than anybody could have thought. And they jumped on the mitigation effort very early, and really were able to prevent a community spread within the facilities, which is very difficult. And so that has been her day-to-day obligation for the last 2 years.
So you mentioned reentry programs. Does that fall under her mandate, or is it just an associative
Yeah.
role?
Yeah, no, that does fall under her.
Wow. So she must be pretty proud of the efforts into that. I mean, I would think that that's probably one of the bigger challenges.
It is, and it's interesting because I've been learning through her to understand sort of what all that means. And one of the distinctions that I've heard her talk about is that it used to be that reentry would become a topic sort of maybe 6 months prior to the expected release of an inmate back into society. They would start talking about, okay, where are you going to go? Where are you going to live? What do you need? So forth. And now it really actually starts the day after they enter prison. And they start looking at what is your educational background? Where do you need help? Can we set you up with some educational opportunities in the prison on a particular trade or a particular skill? And really helping them, do that even in prison, and not just doing it sort of at the last minute before they get released. And even during the pandemic, literally still in March of last year, in March of 2020, all the programming moved virtual, and so it was not discontinued, unlike in quite a few prison systems around the country. A lot of the programming continued virtually, so inmates were able to continue to develop skills and have access to counseling and so forth, even while no visitors were allowed inside the facility.
Is she able to share her success stories with other commissioners around the U.S. and try to benefit them
Yeah.
in the same scenarios?
Yes, there are a number of groups that are basically correctional leadership groups. For the entire country, and then also for the mid-Atlantic and sort of eastern United States. And she's part of all of them, and they've really been sharing a lot of success stories from each of their systems. And so absolutely, it's something that. It's already sort of an 18-hour-a-day job, without doing that. But both her and her colleagues have really gone out of their way to share sort of best practices with other prison systems, even with some outside the country, to just sort of say, okay, what has worked, what has not worked, they did things like start taking temperature checks for staff early on. Now they're doing things like giving inmates what they call good time credit for getting vaccinated, or getting some free commissary items for getting vaccinated, because they want to obviously, reach maximum vaccination goals as quickly as possible, and they have. But it's something you have to constantly stay on top of.
Michael, just before we started recording this, you and I and Quinn were chatting about the difference between the political system here in Canada and Germany and the United States. Of course, our Canadian system is based on the old British system. What do you think people outside of the United States should know about the American system of politics?
Short story.
A lot. Yeah, right. Answers you can give in 2 minutes or less, right? I would say that probably one of the things that I have seen the most is from outside the United States in terms of misperceptions is an overestimation of the power of the president and an underestimation of the power of the president. And I'll explain both briefly. I'll take the latter first. An underestimation of the power of the presidency in the United States is that I've heard a lot of comments from people in Europe and in Asia over the last, let's just say 130 or 140 days. Since January 20th, people have commented that they can't believe how quickly things have changed in Washington. How the tone has changed, how the rhetoric has changed, how sort of the whole atmosphere changed almost overnight in the United States, which, at least speaking for Germany, even when there's a complete change in sort of the politics in Berlin, or there's a turnover from one party to another, the change seems to take months and months, or maybe even a year, to really kind of become apparent to everybody. And in this case, at least, the President Biden has had an immediate impact on sort of changing the tone of America's foreign policy, and changing the tone of sort of the presidency, of the way that the American people perceive it, day in and day out. Now, the overestimation of the presidency, I think, that I see from an international perspective, is that it's there is some thinking that, well, why isn't the president doing this and why isn't the president doing that, and a lack of understanding from the rest of the world, really how America's government works. And I'm not just talking about Congress and the role of the House of Representatives and the role of the U.S. Senate, but also the fact that, and I say this with some hyperbole, that the United States is not just one country. It's effectively 50 countries that are in a compact called the United States of America, that still has 50 governors with 50 state constitutions and 50 state court systems that can slow things down or speed things up. And so you have a situation where some things that somebody might say, well, here in New York, we have seen no difference, even though all those things that Joe Biden says or that President Biden says, we have not seen, why isn't this bridge being fixed, or why isn't this being done? And that's sort of the overestimation of thinking that President Biden can do all these things quickly, when they require a lot of cooperation, not just from Congress in Washington, but also from and not just even governors in each of the 50 states, but also from perhaps state legislators and local legislators. And I think things are just, even in comparing it to Germany, the domestic authority and responsibilities of a chancellor are very different from the domestic responsibilities and authority of a president of the United States. And so I think that's probably the way that I would briefly frame it. I'm generally very proud when I speak to international international folks in general, whether they're from Canada or Mexico or Germany or the UK, about how much they know about America and how much they know about the American system, which is certainly tends to be much more than most Americans know about the systems of those other countries. But the biggest misconceptions I find are these 2 points, which is sort of a general overestimation and an underestimation of the power of the presidency.
Very interesting. Michael, I mean, as you know, here in Canada, we don't vote directly for the Prime Minister, the position of Prime Minister. We vote for the Member of Parliament or a candidate running for a particular party. We just had a case here in Nova Scotia where the Premier of the province replaced a retiring Premier. So there has to be an election. He was appointed, and certainly different. How, for those who may not understand, Question Iowa was a head scratcher for me, was the Electoral College. Can you give us a basic 101 on that?
Sure. I mean,
Please.
First of all, it was the Electoral College, as I understand it. I'm not a historian, but I certainly have studied this as a layperson. it really came out of a sort of almost geographic necessity of essentially looking at in sort of the times of the late 1700s and early 1800s of saying, okay, you're going to conduct an election, which are essentially local elections, because they are states that are holding these elections, and then we have to all sort of gather somewhere and essentially say, okay, well, so how did California vote, and how did Florida vote, and they would get on their horse and ride to ride east basically, and report the results, and thinking. So I think there was a practical underpinning to it, I guess is what I'm saying, and then of course that has been adjusted over the years based on population size and so forth, and it ties back ultimately to the census, the U.S. Census, which has to be conducted every 10 years. But I think in a lot of ways, I think there are a lot of there are a lot of I guess design flaws in U.S. democracy. I don't know that the Electoral College ultimately is one of them. I don't mean to be a defender of it one way or the other. I think it is going to be the way that federal presidential elections will be conducted for the foreseeable future. But the quick primer really is that ultimately comes down to the origins of geography and a concern that smaller states not be tremendously disadvantaged over larger states, especially as the country expanded westward. And you have a little tiny state like Delaware, which literally, it has less than 1 million people, has about 900,000, I think. And then you have these giant territories to the west, whether it be Texas or Oregon or California or Montana, Wyoming, and the thinking really was that, well, how do you manage all of that and do it in a way that is sort of equitable and fair, and in a lot of ways, it seems that, do Americans really directly elect elect their president? I'd say they do. I think it's it can be a bit frustrating when you sort of sit there on the election night and you say, okay, what does this really mean? But the rules are out there, and it's well established. And I think that overall, you can't argue that the system hasn't worked and that it hasn't self-corrected. But it certainly it could be fine-tuned, but it's such a difficult thing to make constitutional amendments that I will be surprised if that's something that is addressed in our lifetime.
So, Michael, you had a very unique opportunity to work on the Biden campaign when he was running for president. What can you tell us about how that came about?
Well, first of all, certainly the greatest honor to have had the opportunity to be involved from the beginning. It was the first and only presidential campaign that I've ever been involved in any way, and certainly I would say the last. Obviously we believe that President Biden will run for re-election, and then certainly I would hope to be involved again. But really the way that came about is that because we have been close to President Biden and his family, and my wife in particular. When my wife Claire and I were married, it'll be 18 years ago this year. Now President Biden, then Senator Biden, gave the toast at our wedding, and it was always clear. He had been, and that was in part because my wife's father had passed away. So he really gave the toast instead of her deceased dad, and my wife had volunteered on his presidential campaign back in 1987. That was his first campaign. She had volunteered on it in the campaign that he did. I think was it in 2000? No, 2008. Excuse me. And then obviously was also involved during the Obama-Biden presidential campaign. Now, during all that time, I had not been involved in any way other than, attending a few events. But once it became clear that then Vice President Biden would make a run to try and make sure that the 45th president was not going to be reelected, which really, without getting into the politics, we started all in our circle of friends and family, or at least in our sort of closest circle, we started feeling was really becoming a national emergency situation, frankly. That we felt that this had to be all hands on deck, and we all had to help. And literally, I was willing, along with many of my friends and colleagues, were willing to sort of put our lives on hold to do whatever little we could to get involved. And given that it is just a fact in the United States that elections, in part because of the fact that so much of it is conducted on television and it takes advertising dollars, elections are expensive. And given that Joe Biden is from a very small state, he's not from California, he's not from New York, he's not from Florida, he's not from Texas, he's not from Illinois, really didn't have a very large network of donors to be able to go to and just sort of, raise the money and start competing with the 45th president. We felt that we asked the question early on, how could we best help? And I was told, both my wife and I were told early on, that the best way we can help would be to reach out to everybody we know who is legally able to contribute to the presidential election. So unfortunately, I was not able to tap most of my global network of friends and colleagues in other countries, because you have to be a U.S. citizen to be able to contribute, of course. But really, from the day that he announced, and I remember the day, it was April 25th of 2019. I was actually in Europe that day for work, but we knew that was the day, and we all dialed into a conference line. And when he shared with all of us that he was going to run for president, and then the news media release went out about, I think it was maybe about 6 hours later, and from that day on, for the until election night in 2020, really almost every day there was, I was calling people, emailing people, and doing it, of course, in my spare time. Early on, we attended a lot of events together until the pandemic put a stop to that in the middle of March of 2020. But before that, my wife and I co-hosted his largest fundraiser in Delaware. I co-hosted several other fundraisers. And I went out to Iowa, and I was had the honor of being what's called a precinct captain in a small precinct east of Des Moines, essentially where voters would gather and ask questions about the candidates' various positions. And I represented Joe Biden in that precinct. And I was involved in a number of other events over that time period, including many Zoom fundraisers, and so then really it was a unique circumstance, because to me, I despite of what it might look like, I'm not very sort of politically even see myself necessarily as a Democrat. I'm a business person. I'm an entrepreneur. I want the right thing to be done for this country for the long term. I did feel that this was a circumstance. This was an election that I had to get involved in, however little I could do to make sure that President Biden would put an end to the policies that had been conducted over the previous 4 years.
So within the first little while, President Biden was not sitting back on his laurels. He came in and he started to work right away. With that in mind, how much of a attitudinal change or environmental change do you think existed in DC and internationally after he took office and started getting to work?
I would really say that there was a lot of what I'd almost call whiplash uh, in Washington in particular, and in many foreign capitals, because things changed so abruptly. After the White House had not conducted a single briefing for reporters for several months, literally within hours they had their first White House briefing, and then that's just press contact. And then they had one every day. They've had one every day since, or every business day since. Putting the press briefing room back into service. That's just one example. I think that it's taken a lot of adjustment, but in a lot of, and I think it's mostly been positive adjustment. I also think that there's no question that Republicans and Democrats won't always agree, and in fact, more often than not, they will disagree on policy. I think one of the things that President Biden really has done, at least from my personal perspective, is to again emphasize to everyone that it is perfectly okay to agree to disagree, but to do so in a civil manner, and to do so in a way that people that might be overhearing the conversation don't have to call their children out of the room because of the language that's used. And I think that there really has been, to use maybe an American phrase, there really has been a new sheriff in town since January 20th. There's a very different tone. And it has been, from my perspective, a very welcome and very fast change that, of course, I would say a lot of people are still adjusting to. And one of the things I was reading in the news just earlier today is about a particular piece of legislation that is currently making its way through Congress, and it has not been in the news very much, but it's a very important piece of legislation. And one of the reporters remarked that this particular bill, this particular law, is being worked in Congress using a regular order, quote unquote, and regular order meaning the way that it used to be, but that it hasn't been in years. And
exactly.
and that's a little bit inside baseball. It's a little bit inside baseball, but frankly, even this preceded even Donald Trump, in the sense that regular order hasn't been regular order on Capitol Hill for a long time. And I think certainly, not just Democrats and Republicans, but also journalists and other, members of the diplomatic corps in Washington are adjusting to regular order again. And in a lot of ways, that's a great development for America. I think we're seeing that reflected in business optimism, in that people sort of say, what made America great over the last, almost 250 years is what can really have an impact again on business and really all the countries that do business with the United States over the next 50 years. And I think we're seeing that. And it's certainly good timing that it coincides with also the reemergence out of the pandemic, which is certainly in full swing in the United States and thankfully in many other countries.
So if we put the pandemic aside for a second, what was it like working under 45 as opposed to like 44, 43, or even now under 46?
From a work perspective, I will say that, again, politics aside, the environment under the 45th president became almost unworkable, in the sense that whether I was dealing with clients from China or from Germany or from other countries, the fact that their leaders or their entrepreneurs were under threat of being attacked on Twitter any given day made it very difficult to even just plan conference calls or plan meetings. Again, nothing to do with the pandemic, but when you would plan a visit to a country and then you didn't know whether there might be some fight that would break out literally the day before, it just caused everybody kind of to go into their corners and say, you know what, let's just hold off for a little bit. And so, I mean, there were, I don't mean to exaggerate, there were literally countless business arrangements that didn't come to pass because people said, you know what, we're just going to wait until the climate is a little bit better. And by climate, they didn't mean the weather; they meant the business
Yeah,
climate and the
exactly.
political climate. And so it's kind of like, and I have to say that again, not wanting to sound overly dramatic, but I feel a little bit like the rest of the world understood that it was possible for Trump to be elected under the democratic system of the United States, and he was elected. And they kind of, I mean, when I would talk to people in a business context, they would sort of say, look, we understand, you know, he's your president, and this is the climate we're in, this is the situation. But I sort of felt that if he had been reelected, it
Wow.
would have sort of been like almost unforgivable for the United States. I mean, I don't know what I would have been able to say to people because I think President Biden has said it, that 4 years can be seen as an aberration in America's history. It can be seen as sort of something that happened that was abnormal. 8 years starts to fundamentally change the country.
Yeah, we've
And
seen it a
and it's
bit
really,
in
and
Canadian politics as
yeah,
well, where once in a blue moon you get that spite vote or something along that. Oh my God, they're all making us mad. We're gonna put these guys in. They can't screw it up any better than anybody else, right? Let's give them a shot. And lo and behold, they screw it up. We experienced that not that long ago with the NDP. But
sure.
you know, you're right. I think that if he had made it back in, oh my Lord, I shudder to think how bad that could have been. And I agree
Yeah,
on the
and I really, and no, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was to say, and I want to emphasize again that I'm not necessarily talking about policies. I mean, there's certainly lots of issues that you could find with policy, but again, people can agree to disagree on policy. You know, some people are more aggressive on some ways. Some people have a different view of monetary policy, for example, or even immigration policy. I mean, I think people can agree to argue on that, but I think it's a matter of tone and climate and political climate and sort of you know, treating others the way you wish to be treated. And I think that's where a lot of the things that were inexcusable really impacted business. So there, because you asked the question about, so how was it different to do business under, you know, 44, 45, 46? And I tell you that, I mean, America as a whole, it's just so much more attractive as a business destination and as an area to explore business opportunities under the 46th president than it was under the 45th president. And that's just a fact. And it has nothing to do with the politics, in my opinion. It has to do more with sort of the atmosphere, the civil discourse, you know, the way that people treat each other with respect. And I think it was not necessarily seen by all Americans at the time how that really impacted America's image abroad.
You just spoke of how the United States is emerging from this global pandemic. Michael, I'm going to ask you to look into your corporate crystal ball, if you would, and give us a sense of, because you're very experienced politically and in international business, of where you predict the next 6 months, let's say, will go as far as the landscape is concerned, coming out of further emergence
Sure.
of the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, and it's very difficult to have a crystal ball, and oftentimes you fall flat on your face. But I will go out on a limb and I will say that I believe that one of the most encouraging statistics that I have seen, that I saw in the middle of the pandemic, is the increase of the savings rate in America, which used to be very, very low and quite a bit lower than in much of the Western world, certainly much lower than it is in Germany, as an example. And what that has told me or informed me is that once the pandemic is over, or about to be over, or we're reemerging, as we all say, there's going to be not just a pent-up demand to go to concerts, to go to movies, to travel, and sort of experience, the life that we used to live, but there also will be the means to do so. There will be the financial means to do so, and that is not just because of the government aid that has been provided in the U.S., which has been, of course, quite significant in its depth and breadth, but also because of the fact that even without that, expenditures of the average American consumer, and I think not just the American consumer, but a lot of consumers around the world, have been so dramatically reduced from what they used to be, because people aren't, spend 1 year not meeting up in a bar, not, going to a cafe or doing all the other things that people do typically, and that has essentially resulted in an accumulation of funds in their pocket. Now, it's not necessarily, it's not an amazing amount of money for most people, but it is still a fact that the savings rate has gone up significantly, and the credit card debt has gone down, which I think those things really bode well for consumer spending to significantly rebound over the next 6 months. And I'm told, I'm not an economist, but I'm told that the consumer spending makes up roughly 75% of America's gross domestic product. 75%. So 3/4 of the U.S. economy is essentially consumer-related spending. Yet for the last year, virtually nobody has spent any money in a hotel. Virtually nobody has spent any money at a theater or at a concert or at any of the other kinds of things. Going to see a Broadway show, or very little money has been spent on travel, whether gas, getting in your car, or flying somewhere, or taking a train somewhere. And so I believe that the consumer is going to lead the American economy, and not just the American economy, but I think a lot of the large global economies higher over the next 6 months. The question is what comes after that. The question is whether, that and the digital transformation of much of the economy, the fact that even pockets that were not digitized have become digitized over the last year, whether that is going to result in ultimately net job losses, or whether it's going to simply result in more efficiency and more profitability of companies. I would say the jury is out on that. I happen to be an optimist, but I think that it's going to be a bit mixed. And so I think that certainly, as is often said on television, Wall Street is not the same as Main Street. I think that whether Main Street, will be happy, 1 year from now, probably will have an impact on whether Wall Street will be happy 1 year from now, or maybe 6 months from now, since Wall Street tends to be ahead of Main Street. So I think that'll be interesting to see. But when you're looking at sort of discretionary spending ability of most Americans, it is currently at a I believe at a high point, and so I think that especially coming into the summer months, and people that have been largely at home, the weather is getting better, people are getting out there, and I will be again, to a degree that I don't have a crystal ball. If I were to forecast the next 6 months, I think they're going to be largely very optimistic for most people. And unless there's some unforeseen event that is hard to, that is hard to foresee or impossible to foresee. I think the current sort of optimistic tone is gonna persist for through the rest of this year.
Well, Michael, we certainly appreciate your time today and chatting with us. We could probably talk for another hour yet, but I really want to thank you for joining us today on our program. We've been speaking with Michael Marquardt, a business entrepreneur and consultant.
I'm Gary Nickerson,
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
and this has been Outside My Window.